Well, it was the summer of '08, and I had gone outside to mow my grass. Had to push mower. I really enjoyed mowing my grass because it was 45 minutes where just nothing to think about at all except following this line. And I got done, and it was all I could do to literally drag myself into my couch and just fall into it. I was just absolutely whipped. Well, fortunately, I had already scheduled a annual physical, like the following week. Went to see the doctor, and he said, well, we probably ought to do a pulmonary function test, or what's called a PFT. And he sent me to have that done. It's where they have you take a deep breath in, blow it out, see how much force you have, how much volume. I went back to see him, and he said, well, yeah, I think there's something definitely wrong because your volume, your lungs are not up to what they should be. And so he sent me to see one guy, but I couldn't see him for 4 or 5 months, so I got in to see somebody at University Hospital. And went and saw them, talked to them. They did a bronchostomy, which is a very normal thing for transplant recipients and pre-transplant, where they go in and they look at your lungs. And they said, yes, you have what's called idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. Idiopathic being a wonderful medical term for we don't have a freaking clue how you got this.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we'll put a big word there so you won't question it. Pulmonary fibrosis literally means your lungs are turning into scar tissue. We said, okay, but here we take this series of prednisone. If that doesn't work, we'll try something else. Well, of course, that didn't work. I tried something else that didn't work. And they said, well, just come in every 3 months and we'll take a look at it, see how you're doing. So my wife and I left, and it was kind of like, we just kind of felt like we got, shoved out the door. And then I did a little research online, come to discover that pulmonary fibrosis is what they call an end-stage disease. End-stage being a wonderful new word, meaning you're going to die.
Mm-hmm.
It's terminal. I thought, well, that was nice of them, to tell us that. So, being a little frustrated, I got back in to see the original doctor. Ordered a whole battery of tests. I went to see a bunch of different specialists to rule out things. They did what's called a thoracotomy, which where they went in from the back and took out a bigger sample than they do with a bronchostomy. And yeah, it was pulmonary fibrosis. So he referred me to Methodist, to the transplant team there. And my wife and I went in to see Dr. Rowe, who's the chief pulmonary transplant pulmonologist. And in the course of the conversation, Dr. Rowe goes, well, now you have to understand that a transplant is a quality of life issue, not a quantity of life issue. And it was just kind of like, huh? And we both kind of sat there, and finally he said, that's the very normal reaction. People just don't realize it. The problem being that once you've had a transplant, the immunosuppressant drugs you have to take so that your body does not reject the lungs opens you up to a whole issue of other problems. Simple things that, an ordinary person would kick off without any problem. Don't do that to a transplant patient, particularly things like flu and pneumonia. But spent 3 days at Methodist going through a whole battery of tests. I had I can't think of it. They went in and looked at your veins around your heart.
Calf, yeah.
Yeah. So I have it on paper that I actually do have a heart.
Debatable.
Because I know that's been questioned at times by people. This was in September of '09. In January of 10, no, sorry. I was still too well to go on the list. It wasn't until January of 11 that I was on oxygen full time that I actually went on the list. And I started, I think, at number 3 on the list, dropped down to number 8, came back to number 5. But, nothing really happened. And with pulmonary fibrosis, you have a tendency to sort of go along, drop, go along, drop, like that. And unfortunately, in February of 12, I developed what's called a peritoneal cyst, which is an open wound on your backside. And I went to the surgeon, had it stitched up. He did. A week later, the stitches came apart. May he rot someplace. And spent 6 months with the wound care, trying to get this wound healed up because they had to take me off the list. They could not transplant me with an open wound. And during that time, I could do no rehabilitation, could not work out at all. Finally, in September, I went to a surgeon and he did what's called a wound flap surgery, which took care of it. But it turns out I had 5 different bacteria in me.
Overachiever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, if you're going to do it, might as well do it right.
Go big or go home.
Yeah. And what was worse is I had to spend 2 weeks in the hospital, flat on my back, could not move. Finally got out, spent 2 weeks at home, flat on my back, could not move. All this time I'm taking intravenous antibiotics to clear up all these bacteria that I've got. But finally they cleared it, I was healed, all the bacteria was gone, and so I could start trying to go back to pulmonary rehabilitation, which was a joke. Me going from the car inside to pulmonary rehab, it reminded me a lot of Marley's ghost in Scrooge. How he walks with all the boxes chained to him and following him. I was like that, but only with air canisters. I think at one point I'd get out of the car, we'd have 3 different sets of canisters, trying to maneuver myself and them in. But I think the 3rd time I was at rehab, Julie Nelson, who ran it, took one look at me, said, "Sit down," and called Dr. Rowe, who came over, and said, "Okay, we're admitting you." And this was roughly early 1st of December, somewhere in that neighborhood.
Right at the end of November.
And so I was in a hospital, basically just waiting. At this point, I was on like 28 liters of oxygen while I'm lying down, which is a pretty significant flow.
Yeah, it is.
At one point, they did come in and said, "We've got a pair of lungs for you. They're in Texas." So all the nurses, there's 4 or 5 nurses in my room, and they're running around and doing things and giving me an IV of some rejection drug I need to have before the transplant and all this stuff. And everybody's really upbeat and good. And then I see the door open and this small guy in a suit kind of look at one of the nurses and motion her over. And it was the charge nurse, and he's speaking to her. I could just watch her face, just kind of like, oh. And it turns out that when they took the lungs out, they were too badly scarred on the back, so they couldn't use them. So I'm still in the hospital, and one of the funniest things was one time when your mother was there, Dr. Rowe decides he wants me to exercise. Now, I can barely lift my head up at times. I'm so weak. But they bring a stationary bike in my room, and they somehow get me on top of that bike, and your mother was so furious that she had to walk out of the room. That here I am. It's all I could do to move a pedal. And Rose taking a picture of it, I wasn't looking at him working out. I'm like, holy crap, you're gonna kill me.
I think that was after you popped that fever.
Huh?
I think that was after you popped your fever.
Could be, I don't know. Things kind of blur after a while.
That's true.
But then on a Friday, Roe came in and said, "I'm having them send me every possible lung that comes up this weekend, because if we don't transplant you this weekend, we're going to have to send you to Mayo or Cleveland, because we're going to have to put you on an ECMO machine," which is a bypass blood air thing. Certainly there's better technology, but And they've never transplanted anybody off an ECMO machine at that point in time. But then Sunday afternoon,
Sunday morning.
huh?
Sunday morning.
Well, it was not about noon,
Maybe.
because a bunch of people had come in after church.
That's true.
A bunch of people in the room, and all of a sudden this big guy, wearing kind of a shabby overcoat, steps in the door and says, "Well, I got a pair of lungs for you." And later, talking to everybody who was in the room that time, we all had the exact same thought. You know, what street corner did this guy get them from? Well, it turns out it was Dr. Harmuth, who was a very excellent thoracic surgeon. And about 3 in the afternoon, I'd say 3 or 4,
Yes.
I went down, and that's the last thing I remember for a while.
Yeah.
I was told at one point in the recovery, they asked me where I was, and I told them I was in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
And they asked me what year it was, and I said 1969.
Mm-hmm.
But in spite of that, they still went ahead and woke me up, I guess.
They did. Yeah, I was there for that.
And I was there till,
January 15th.
I thought it was either the 11th or 21st.
It is whatever day is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, because I had that day off of work.
Oh, that's 21st.
And it was the 21st.
I was finally released. I have never had a problem with my lungs. I have gotten a virus that came with my lungs, but the lung themselves have just been spot on ever since. And that's the story.
So you would think that people signing up to be a donor is very important?
It's not very important, it's vital. There are still far more people needing organs than we have on the transplant list. We're fortunate here in Indiana, we do have a high rate of people signing up, but it's never enough. And people don't realize it's not just heart, lungs, kidneys, livers. They do skin grafts, they do bone grafts,
Absolutely.
eyes, corneas, all types of things. So yes, that's why.
Every kind of tissue.
Yeah, Driven to Save Lives is a great campaign. Donor Network is wonderful. I'm giving a talk at Methodist this Thursday night for Donor Network. And anything that can be done to support them is excellent.
Okay. Anything else you want to say? I'm giving you free rein.
Oh,
We'll consider this your waving of the white flag.
no.
You sure?
Yeah, that's good for now.
Well, obviously he's getting a repeat guest.
We all picked up on that term.
Well, yeah, I'm certain this is going to be a big bump
I think
in your
so.
ratings.
I think so.
I think so.
Once the word gets out that I am